Nobody expected to find her alive. The farmhouse had been sitting empty for 11 months. Locals drove past it without slowing down. The county had flagged the property twice. Animal control had gotten a single call, investigated nothing, closed the file. And still, somewhere behind that rusted gate and those waist-high weeds, a 6-year-old girl had been breathing, eating, waiting, completely invisible to every institution that existed specifically to find her. Ryker Boone almost missed her too. He would have, if not for the dogs. 2 of them. Motionless at the fence line, not barking, not running, just watching him with the kind of stillness that didn't belong to animals that had gone feral. It belonged to animals that were still working, still on duty, still guarding something they refused to abandon. And when Ryker cut the Harley's engine and the silence rushed back in like cold water, he heard it, the softest, quietest sound in the world. A child, turning a page. If this story hits something in your chest, stay with it until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Let's ride. The highway had no name on the map Ryker used, which was the point. He'd stopped trusting GPS somewhere around the 3rd year after discharge, when the voice kept routing him back through towns that reminded him of places he'd been ordered to level. Paper maps had a kind of honesty about them. They showed you roads but didn't tell you what to feel when you got there. This particular stretch of county blacktop cut through the middle of a dying agricultural valley in western Pennsylvania, flat farmland pressing in from both shoulders. The sky overhead, the pale gray-white of old dishwater. It was the kind of sky that didn't commit to anything. Not storm, not sun, just the ambient light of a Tuesday in late October that asked nothing of anyone. Ryker rode it at 60, no windshield between him and the cold, the Harley Road King growling beneath him with the low, steady authority of an engine that had been properly maintained rather than babied. He wore a leather jacket that had been black once, and was now something closer to charcoal, cracked along the left collar from years of use. The patch on the back read Iron Parish MC, in block letters arced above a simple compass rose. No skull, no flame pomme, no theater. Just direction. He'd sewn it on himself. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular. That was the truth, even if it wasn't the kind of truth people understood when they asked. He had a storage unit in Ohio with a change of clothes, a sleeping bag, and a small box of things he didn't look at. He had a phone with 4 contacts in it. He had a per diem from a veterans consultation gig that required him to check in once a month and nothing else. He had the road, and the road had no feelings about him either way, which was the closest thing to peace he'd found in 6 years. He almost didn't see the dogs at all. They were at the fence line of a property set back about 40 yards from the road. 2 of them, a large mixed breed with the build of a shepherd and the coloring of something older and harder, and a smaller one, stockier, barrel-chested, with a graying muzzle that suggested age. They weren't moving, they weren't barking. They stood side by side at the gap where the fence had bent away from the post, and they watched the highway with an attention that wasn't threat and wasn't fear. It was the attention of sentries, of animals that had learned that watching was work. Ryker's hand eased on the throttle before his brain caught up to why. He'd spent time with dogs in theater, not military working dogs, just dogs. Village dogs, farm dogs, the kind that latched onto patrol units and became unofficial mascots until one day they didn't come back and nobody had the energy to talk about it. He knew the difference between a dog that had gone feral and a dog that was still attached. These 2 were attached, which meant something was still here to be attached to. He pulled off the road. The gravel shoulder was loose and uneven, half reclaimed by dead grass, and the flat brown stalks of whatever crop had been growing here before the field was left to itself. He got the kickstand down and swung off the bike, and the dogs shifted without breaking their line, just adjusted their angle to track him. The larger one lowered its head slightly. Still no sound. Ryker stood still. "Easy," he said, not loudly, more to himself than to them. He walked toward the fence slowly, keeping his hands visible, his body angled rather than direct. Old fieldcraft, animal or otherwise, you don't approach anything head-on when you don't know what you're walking into. The gate was a length of rusted cattle panel chained with a padlock that had corroded open years ago. The chain simply looped for the appearance of security. Beyond it, the gravel drive had disappeared under growth. The farmhouse sat about 60 yards back. Two-story, white paint gone the color of wet chalk. One upstairs window boarded, a porch that sagged on the left side like a shoulder with a bad joint. But it wasn't the house that stopped him. It was the structure to the right of it. Ryker had worked construction summers before he enlisted, and he knew what a purpose-built enclosure looked like versus what someone threw together out of panic or meanness. This had been built deliberately. Heavy gauge wire, properly framed with treated lumber posts sunk in concrete, a plywood roof section sealed with tar paper that still held its shape. Someone had spent real money on this. Real time. The enclosure was roughly 12 by 16 feet, and inside it there was a wooden platform raised off the ground, a heavy wool blanket folded in the corner, and a small girl sitting cross-legged with a picture book open in her lap. She looked up at him. Not afraid. Not surprised. She looked at him the way someone looks at a car that slows down and then passes, with the calm resignation of someone who has learned not to invest in things that might not stop. She had dark hair that hadn't been cut in a long time, hanging past her shoulders in uneven lengths. She wore a coat that was too big for her, a man's barn coat with the cuffs rolled up, over a sweater that had a pattern of small birds on it. Her feet were in rubber boots. She looked clean, fed, or recently enough. And her eyes were the specific kind of steady that came not from fearlessness, but from having already processed all the fear available and come out the other side. She couldn't have been older than 6. The dogs moved then, placing themselves between Ryker and the enclosure door, the larger one angling its body with the deliberate ease of something that had done this before. Not aggression, position. "Hey," Ryker said, to the girl. His voice came out rougher than he intended, like a door that hadn't been opened in a while. She looked at him. "You live here," he said. Not a question. He could see the evidence of habitation everywhere once he was looking for it. The small boot prints in the dirt, the neat stack of 3 or 4 books near the platform, a tin cup with a lid, a rope handle on the enclosure door that had been tied with the kind of knot a child learns and keeps using because it holds. The girl turned a page. "My name's Ryker." Nothing. He put his hands on his knees and crouched, bringing himself closer to eye level with her. One of the dogs shifted. He stopped moving. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, then, in a voice so small it barely disturbed the air, "Ren." He nodded, didn't push, stood up slowly, looked around the property with the systematic sweep of someone running threat assessment and coming up empty. No movement in the house, no vehicles, no indication of another adult presence. He looked back at her. "You hungry?" The question seemed to confuse her more than anything he'd said so far. Not because she didn't understand it, but because she wasn't sure what the right answer was. He watched her work through it, that small, private calculation of someone who had learned that the way you answer questions determines what happens next, and what happens next is not always good. "I have jerky," he said, "and some crackers. Nothing great." She looked at him for another long moment. "The dogs are hungry," she said finally. Ryker went back to the bike. He didn't call anyone that night. He didn't call the county. He didn't call the state. He sat in his truck. He had a truck, an old F250 with a hitch receiver for the bike trailer parked 3 miles back at a defunct grain elevator that had a flat gravel lot. And he turned the heat on and stared at the water stains on the windshield and thought about the particular quality of the silence that had been inside that enclosure. He'd heard silences like that before, in recovery wards, in the specific after-quiet of spaces where something had already happened that couldn't be undone. He didn't sleep much. He was back before 7 the next morning with a bag from the gas station 20 miles back, beef sticks, peanut butter crackers, 2 bottles of water, a can of dog food, and a folding can opener he'd found in the glove box. He also had a blanket from behind the truck seat, one of those emergency Mylar ones in the orange pouch, because the temperature had dropped overnight and he'd heard rain sometime around 3 a.m. The dogs heard him before he reached the gate. The larger one appeared first from behind the house, tracking his approach with those steady, operational eyes. Then the smaller one came around the other side, and Ryker understood something about their patrol pattern. They split the property into sectors and covered them in rotation. Someone had trained these dogs, or they'd learned it themselves, which was a different kind of remarkable. Ren was already awake. She was sitting on the platform with a different book, thinner, with a worn cover. and she watched him approach with the same reserved attention she'd had the day before, but something had shifted slightly. She'd moved the rope handle from the inside of the enclosure door to the outside latch, which meant she'd made a decision, somewhere in the night, about whether or not to allow for the possibility of a door being opened. Ryker noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He set the bag on the ground outside the enclosure wire, crouched, and slid the dog food and opener through the gap at the bottom where the wire had warped up from the ground. Then the water. Then the crackers and beef sticks, one at a time, slowly, so she could see each item before it crossed into her space. The dogs inspected everything before she touched it. That was the system. "Big one's Colt," she said when she caught him watching them. "That one's Hazel." "Good names," Ryker said. "Grandpa named them." He waited. When nothing else came, he said, "Is your grandpa inside?" She looked down at the book. "He's gone," she said. The flatness of it was the worst thing he'd heard in a long time. Not grief, or not anymore. Just the report of a fact she'd processed until it couldn't hurt her the way it used to. How long? She thought about it with genuine effort, counting something that didn't have clean numbers. "A while," she said finally. Ryker sat down on the cold ground outside the wire. He had no plan for what he was doing here. That was the truth, and he knew it, and he stayed anyway. He came back the next day, and the day after that. On the fourth day, he brought a paperback. Something simple, short chapters, a story about a boy and a horse that he'd found in a bin outside a thrift shop in the county seat. He didn't know if it was age-appropriate for a 6-year-old. He didn't know much about 6-year-olds. He slid it through the gap, and Colt sniffed it and stepped aside, and Wren picked it up and looked at the cover for a long time without reading it, just looking at the horse. "You know how to read?" he asked. "Grandpa taught me." "He taught you a lot?" "Everything," she said. Simple as that. Everything. Ryker rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the sky. It was going to rain again. He could smell it. That specific front edge of cold moisture that he'd learned to read on the back of his hand long before he'd learned to read a barometer. He needed to bring her a better tarp. The plywood roof section was holding, but the east seam had a gap he could see from here. "Wren," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm not going to do anything you don't say I can do." She looked at him. "Did you ever want to leave He didn't know what to call it. Leave here? She thought about this for a long time, long enough that a car passed on the distant highway, and they both tracked the sound without meaning to. "Grandpa said the woods were dangerous," she said. "The woods?" "I went in once and I got really lost, and it got dark." She paused. "He was scared. I'd never seen him scared before. He built this to—" She stopped, started again. "He said it was so I'd always have somewhere safe to come back to." Ryker stared at the ground. The enclosure wasn't a cage. He'd been wrong about what he was looking at. Or partly wrong. The shape of it had the grammar of confinement, wire and post and locked gate, but the intention had been the opposite. Someone who loved this child had looked at their own limitations. Age, remote location, a child who wandered, woods that could swallow a person whole, and built the only solution they could afford out of what they had. A fortress instead of a cell. A fixed point in an uncertain world. It didn't make it right, but it made it human in a way that no bureaucratic framework was going to understand. On the 7th day, he came back and found a county vehicle parked at the gate. 2 of them, actually. A white SUV with the Department of Children and Family Services seal on the door, and a green truck from Animal Control. 3 adults stood in the long grass outside the fence, one of them with a clipboard, one on a radio, one just looking at the enclosure with an expression Ryker recognized immediately, the particular set of the mouth that precedes a determination. He parked the truck on the shoulder and got out slowly. He was wearing his cut, the Iron Parish colors, the compass rose, because he'd ridden the Harley here today, and then gone back for the truck, and he hadn't changed, and now he wished he had, and then stopped wishing it because the way these people were going to look at him was the least of the problems. The woman with the clipboard turned when she heard his boots on the gravel. "Sir, this is a county welfare investigation. Are you associated with this property?" "No." he said. Then I'm going to need you to. I've been here every day for a week, he said. I know the child, I know the dogs, and I know you're about to make a decision about something you've been on the property for. He checked his watch. 11 minutes. The woman with the clipboard looked at him the way people looked at him when they saw the patch first and the man second. He was used to it. He didn't move. Inside the enclosure, Wren had pressed herself back against the far wall of the platform, both dogs flanking her, and she was watching the three strangers with the first expression of open fear Ryker had seen on her face since the first day. And something about that, the specific reversal of it, that she had been calm when he arrived and was afraid now, with official help, turned something over in his chest like a cold engine reluctantly starting. The woman with the clipboard was already speaking into the radio. Words like neglect and immediate removal and temporary placement, and the dogs will need to be... And Ryker stopped listening to the words and watched Wren's face instead, and watched the moment she heard the words separated, even from 40 feet away, and watched something go out of her eyes like a light you didn't realize was on until it wasn't. She reached for the rope handle, the inside one. She pulled the enclosure door shut from within, and from inside the wire, in the voice she used when she'd already decided something, quiet as a page turning in an empty house, she said, I'm not going. Ryker looked at the officials. The officials looked at him. The radio crackled. And somewhere in the cold October field, Colt let out a single low sound. Not a bark, not a growl, but something older and heavier than either. And the sound of it moved across the dead grass and reached Ryker's boots and climbed up through him like something he'd forgotten he still had. He turned to the woman with the clipboard. Put it down, he said. She frowned. Excuse me? Whatever you're writing right now. He nodded at the clipboard. Put it down. Because you're about to make a mistake that's going to take a lot longer to fix than the 11 minutes you've been standing here. The woman looked at him for a long moment. Her pen didn't move. Behind her, the animal control officer had his hand on the latch of the green truck's rear compartment, cages rattling faintly against the metal walls. And inside the enclosure, Wren pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders and pressed her face into Hazel's fur and waited, with the patience of a child who had already survived every kind of waiting, for whatever was going to happen to her. The woman with the clipboard had a name tag that read Deborah Hale, caseworker 2, and she had the kind of posture that came from spending years in rooms where nobody was happy to see her. She wasn't unkind. Ryker could see that under the professional distance and the pen that still hadn't moved. She was doing her job. That was the problem. Sir, I understand you have a relationship with the child, but 7 days, Ryker said. That's how long she's been fed and watered and talked to by someone she trusts. Before that, how long did your file sit? Deborah Hale's jaw tightened. The initial report was, how long? She looked at him. 11 months. He let that sit in the air between them like something neither of them wanted to touch. The animal control officer had moved away from the truck. Good. The third official, younger, male, standing slightly behind Deborah, with the particular body language of someone who hadn't fully decided whose side he was on yet, kept glancing between Ryker and the enclosure where Wren had gone silent behind the closed door. She shut herself in, the young one said quietly, more to himself than anyone. Yeah, Ryker said. She did. Deborah made a note on the clipboard. We have to document the living conditions. The enclosure is built by her grandfather, purpose-built, properly framed, weatherproofed. Not a punishment. Protection. Ryker crossed his arms over his chest. The leather of the jacket creaked in the cold. You want to know why he built it? You need to know who he was first. And you've been here 11 minutes. We can't leave a minor in an unsupervised... She's been unsupervised for 11 months, and she's alive, clean, and literate. His voice stayed level. He'd learned a long time ago that volume was for people who needed the room to feel something. He didn't need the room to feel anything right now. She's also, right at this moment, more afraid of you than she has been of anything since her grandfather died. I need you to consider what that means. Deborah Hale looked at the enclosure for a long time. The radio on her hip crackled, and she turned the volume down without taking her eyes off the wire. You have 24 hours, she said finally. I can document this visit as a preliminary welfare check. Inconclusive. pending follow-up. But I need a name on record, someone responsible who can be contacted. She looked at him. Are you willing to put your name on this? Ryker didn't hesitate. Ryker James Boone, Iron Parish MC, chapter out of Harrisburg. He spelled the last name. You can run it. You'll find a DD-214 and a contractor license and a misdemeanor from 2019 that got expunged. Nothing else. She wrote it down, put the clipboard under her arm, looked at him one more time with an expression that wasn't judgment and wasn't sympathy. It was the look of someone filing a piece of information they intended to come back to. 24 hours, she said. She left. The young caseworker followed. The animal control truck backed out last, the cages rattling as it hit the road edge and straightened. Ryker stood in the field until the sound of both engines dissolved into the gray. Then he walked to the enclosure door and stood outside it. They're gone, he said. A long silence. Then the sound of the rope handle moving. The door opened 4 inches. One of Hazel's eyes appeared in the gap, wet and dark. Then Wren's face, pale, composed again, that front re-established over something that had come very close to the surface. Are they coming back? She said. Not a question. Tomorrow, he said honestly. But I bought us some time. She considered this. What happens tomorrow? I don't know yet, he said. I'm working on it. She looked at him for a moment with those old, exhausted eyes, and then she said, okay? And the door opened the rest of the way, and Colt walked out and pressed his skull against Ryker's thigh, with the particular gravity of a large dog choosing to trust something, and Ryker put his hand on the dog's head and stood there in the cold, and understood that he had just made a promise he had absolutely no framework for keeping. He made 2 phone calls from the truck. The first was to a woman named Luz Esparza, who was an intake coordinator at the Allegheny County VA and who owed him nothing but answered on the second ring anyway because that was who she was. He told her what he needed: emergency documentation, character reference, anything that could establish him as a stable known party to a minor in a welfare case. And she told him she'd make calls, and she said it in the tone of someone who understood that time was the variable. The second call was harder. The number rang 4 times, and then a voice answered that was like gravel in a coffee can, low, unhurried, with the kind of patience that came not from ease but from long practice at waiting. Boone, the voice said. Cade? A pause. Long enough to mean something. Where are you? Western Pennsylvania, Derry County. There's a situation. Another pause. The kind of situation that ends with someone in a cage or the kind that starts with it. The second one, Ryker said. I need the chapter. Not for anything loud. I need bodies with records that don't include violence. I need anyone who knows family law. And I need someone who can clean and repair a structure and make it look good enough to photograph. Cade Morrow, president of the Iron Parish Motorcycle Club's Harrisburg chapter, did not respond immediately. Ryker had known him for 9 years, had served 2 deployments to adjacent theaters with him before either of them had ever touched a Harley, and in that time he had learned that Cade's silences were specific. They had different textures, and they meant different things. This one meant he was calculating. How old? Cade said. 6. Another silence. Shorter. I'll make some calls. There's more, Ryker said. There always is with you. The grandfather built her a wire enclosure on the property. As protection, DCFS saw it and saw neglect. I need someone who can reframe the narrative before the follow-up visit. Reframe. Legally, in documentation. He paused. I'm not asking you to lie to anyone, Cade. When have I ever lied to anyone? It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that arrived with its own authentication. I'll send Doyle. He did 3 years of pre-law before he dropped out, and he remembers more than he admits. And I'll send Marsh and Kinney for the structure work. I don't have money right now for... Did I ask you about money? Ryker looked out the windshield at the dark field. The farmhouse was a gray shape against a grayer sky. No lights in the windows, no movement. No, he said. Then stop talking about it. What else? The dogs. 2 of them. Large. They need a vet check and documentation. Health records. Registration. anything that establishes them as domesticated, non-aggressive, licensed animals. If DCFS is going to argue for separation from the child, I need to be able to argue that the animals represent demonstrated therapeutic attachment and pose no public safety risk. Cade was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this. I've been awake all night thinking about this. There's a vet in the chapter, not a member, associate. She does work for Kinney's family. A pause. She'll come. Tomorrow morning early. I'll tell her. Ryker started to say thank you, and Cade hung up before he got there, which was also Cade's way. He slept in the truck that night, parked at the grain elevator with the heat running in intervals to save fuel, the Harley chained to the hitch behind him. He woke twice, once at 2 a.m. when a deer walked through the headlights and stood in them for a long moment like it was deciding something, and once at 4:30 when a sound reached him from the direction of the property that might have been one of the dogs, or might have been wind through a gap in the farmhouse siding. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling fabric of the cab and thought about Wren saying he taught me everything. And he thought about the shape of an enclosure built out of love by hands that didn't know what else to do. At 6:15, he heard motorcycles. 3 of them. He knew the sound before they appeared at the road's edge. The Iron Parish ran primary-driven Harleys, no secondary chain noise, a sound he could identify from a half-mile in the dark. He got out of the truck and stood in the cold morning and watched them pull in. Doyle on his Dyna, thick-necked and quiet, law school dropout turned paralegal turned biker, who carried a legal pad in his left saddlebag at all times and had the handwriting of someone who took notes for a living. Marsh on his softail, lanky and unhurried, a man who had done 2 tours as a Navy Seabee and built things with his hands that lasted. Kinney on his road glide, the youngest of them at 32, with a jaw that had been broken and reset slightly wrong, and eyes that were older than the rest of his face. And behind them, in a small green pickup truck with a veterinary supply decal half peeled off the back window, a woman Ryker hadn't met. Mid-40s, short-cropped salt and pepper hair, practical jacket. She got out of the truck and looked at the property and then at Ryker with the no-nonsense assessment of someone who spent her working life evaluating things under stress. "You're Boone," she said. "Yeah." "Paula Reese, where are the dogs?" Ryker walked them to the property. He hadn't been sure what to expect from Wren when she saw 4 bikers and an unknown woman approaching the fence line at 6:30 in the morning. What he hadn't expected was what actually happened, which was that Wren opened the enclosure door and stepped out, the first time he'd seen her outside the wire in 7 days, and stood in the cold morning light in her oversized coat with both dogs flanking her and looked at the group without flinching. She looked at Ryker. "You brought people," she said. "I did." She looked at the others one at a time, the way a child looks at things when they've learned not to rush their assessment. Doyle gave her a nod. Marsh crouched down to her eye level without being asked, the way a man does when he's been around children enough to remember they're not small adults. Kinney stayed back, his hands in his jacket pockets, giving her space. Paula Reese walked directly to Colt and held out her hand, palm up, and waited. Colt sniffed her. Then he let her touch his jaw. "Good," Paula said. She set her kit bag down and got to work. Doyle had his legal pad out by the time the sun was fully up. He sat with Ryker at the fence line with a thermos of coffee from somewhere and asked questions in the measured, methodical way of someone who was building architecture in his head as he wrote. "The grandfather. Name. I don't have it yet. The house might have documentation. I need it. Death certificate if there is one. And if he had a will, it changes the property situation significantly." Doyle wrote without looking up. "She's been here alone since he died? As far as I can tell. No parent in the picture. None that she's mentioned. That matters. It changes whether this is a missing parent situation or an orphan child situation, and those have different legal tracks." He wrote something. "The enclosure. Yeah. I need to see it, and I need to photograph it in the best possible light, which means Marsh is going to need to do some work this morning on the seam gaps in that east side framing before I document it." He looked up. "Has the DCFS worker seen the inside of the house?" "No, she was outside the fence." "Good. We need to see the inside of the house before she does." Ryker looked at him. "The house isn't mine to enter." Doyle looked back at him with the patience of a man who had been through more than one conversation about the difference between what was technically true and what was strategically important. "Ryker," he said, "you're the responsible party on record for this child right now. That gives you some latitude. I'm not telling you to take anything. I'm telling you to know what's in there before someone who's already decided what they're looking at goes in first." He was right. Ryker knew he was right. He went in through the back door, which wasn't locked, which told him something about how the grandfather had lived, either trusting or too tired for locks, or both. The kitchen was small and clean in the way things get clean when someone has very little and treats what they have carefully. A wood stove, 2 plates on a shelf, a rag rug on the floor that had been patched and repatched until the original pattern was mostly memory, a chair by the window that had been occupied so long it held the shape of whoever had sat in it. He moved through carefully. Living room with a daybed and books. A lot of books, more than you'd expect, stacked on a plank shelf along the entire east wall. He ran his eye along the spines and found everything from basic elementary readers to adult nature writing to what looked like a complete set of encyclopedia volumes from the 1980s. Someone had been educating a child the best way they knew how, in isolation, with what they had. He found the journal on the daybed, beneath a folded blanket. It was a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and it had been written in with a hand that started out steady on the early pages and became shakier as it went on. He read enough to understand. A man in his late 70s, former farmer, only living relative to a granddaughter whose mother, his daughter, had died of an overdose when Wren was 14 months old. No father on record. Social services contact twice in the first year, both times resulting in nothing actionable. The grandfather, whose name was Earl Dempsey, had simply kept the child, raised her, done what he could for as long as he could, and then his heart had started failing, and he'd built the enclosure, and he'd written about it in the journal with the blunt self-awareness of a man who knew exactly what it looked like and didn't have a better option. She wanders. Always has. The woods took her for 6 hours once, and I aged 10 years in that time. I can't run after her anymore. I can barely get up the porch steps. The enclosure has a door she can open from the inside. I made sure of that first. It's not to keep her in. It's to give her somewhere to come back to when I can't go find her. Ryker read that twice. He almost missed the envelope. It was tucked into the back cover of the journal. White, unsealed, his name on it. Except it wasn't his name. It was addressed in a shaky cursive hand to whoever finds this and still gives a damn. He stood in the cold kitchen for a long time. Then he took the journal and the envelope and went back outside. Doyle saw his face when he came through the back door and didn't ask. He just held out the thermos. By 9:30, Marsh had resecured the east seam of the enclosure roof, replaced 2 cracked framing boards with lumber from the truck bed, and dug out and reset the post closest to the gate that had started to lean. He worked without talking, with the economical motion of a man who found the work itself sufficient company. Kinney assisted without being asked, handing tools, holding boards, following Marsh's silent direction with the ease of someone used to operating inside a structure without needing it explained. Paula Reese had completed her examination of both dogs, vaccinations updated from her kit, documentation printed from a portable printer she'd pulled from the truck, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who kept it ready. Physical assessments written on official veterinary letterhead. Both animals were healthy, she said, well-fed, no signs of abuse or neglect, socialized. She'd watched Wren with them for 20 minutes before she wrote a single word, and what she wrote in the behavioral notes section was something Ryker read over Doyle's shoulder and had to step away from for a moment. Subject animals demonstrate consistent protective and responsive behavior toward the minor child consistent with long-term bonding attachment. Both animals display no aggressive response toward familiar adults and managed, non-reactive assessment response toward unfamiliar adults. Separation of these animals from this child would, in my clinical assessment, represent a significant and unnecessary psychological stressor to the child above and beyond the existing trauma of parental and primary caregiver loss. Wren, during all of this, had sat on the ground outside the enclosure, first time she'd done that in Ryker's presence, and let Marsh drink coffee near her without moving away. She'd watched Kinney work, and at one point had said quietly, "That board was rotting." And Kinney had looked at her and said, "I can see that." And she'd said, "Grandpa was going to fix it." And Kinney had said, "Well, Now it's fixed. And that had been the end of that conversation, and somehow it was the right end. Doyle pulled Ryker aside at 10. "There's a problem," he said. "Tell me." "The property. Earl Dempsey didn't have a will, which means when he died, the estate went into intestate succession." He kept his voice low, not looking toward Wren. "If there's no other heir, and from what you've told me there isn't, the state has a claim on the property, which means the county can move to take it, and when they do, the question of what happens to the child becomes a secondary consideration to the question of asset liquidation." "She has an aunt," Ryker said. Doyle looked at him. Wren mentioned her this morning, her mother's sister. She said Grandpa talked about her, that she was in... He tried to remember. Maryland, I think. He'd written to her. After his heart. Doyle was already writing. "I need a last name." "Working on it." The second problem arrived at 11:15, when a black pickup truck with no markings parked at the road edge and a man got out who wasn't county. He was 50-something, raw-boned, with the look of someone who had money in this county that was old enough to have opinions about property. He walked to the fence line and looked at the structure work Marsh was finishing and then at the bikers in general with a specific kind of civic displeasure. "Who authorized repairs on this property?" he said. "To no one in particular, and everyone in general." Doyle stepped forward. "And you are?" "Dale Ferris. I'm on the County Land Management Board. This property is in preliminary assessment for municipal acquisition." Ryker felt something tighten in his chest. "Since when?" he said. "Since 3 weeks ago." Ferris looked at the enclosure. At Wren, who had gone very still. At the dogs. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of statement. "The estate defaulted on 2 years of property tax. County has a lien. The acquisition process is... There's a child living on this property," Ryker said. "I'm aware. That's a DCFS matter." He said it the way you'd say that's a different department. Clean, compartmentalized. "Whose idea was the acquisition?" Doyle said. His voice had gone flat in a way that Ryker recognized as professional danger. Ferris looked at him. "The board's. And the board is how many people? 5 members. And they all agreed 3 weeks ago to move on a property with a known minor in residence who had no adult representation. I told you the child is a DCFS. Matter. Yeah, you said that." Doyle capped his pen. "I'm going to need the board meeting minutes from that session, the filing date on the lien, and the name of whoever reported the property's occupancy status to the board, because someone told 5 people there was no one living here when there clearly was." He looked at Ferris evenly. "That's either an oversight or it isn't. I'd like to find out which." Ferris looked at Doyle for a long moment. Then he looked at Ryker. Then he looked at the Iron Parish patches on 3 separate jackets in his field of vision and did the calculation that people always did and usually got half wrong. "I'll be in touch with County Council," he said. "We'll be here," Doyle said. Ferris left. Kinney came up beside Ryker and watched the black truck pull back onto the road. "So it's not just the state," Kinney said. "Apparently not. Someone wants this land." "Apparently." Kinney was quiet for a moment. "That changes things." It did. A welfare case with a bureaucratic DCFS problem was one kind of fight. A welfare case with a land acquisition play running underneath it was something else. Something with more moving parts, and more money, and more people who needed the outcome to go a specific way. It meant the 24 hours Deborah Hale had given them wasn't a grace period. It was a window, and someone was already trying to close it from the other side. At 1 p.m., Ryker finally opened the envelope from Earl Dempsey's journal. He sat on the lowered tailgate of Marsh's truck and read it once, and then sat with it for a while. The handwriting was bad, the letters large and uneven, the hand of a man whose body had been failing as he wrote. But the words were precise. They were the words of a man who had spent a long time thinking about what mattered. If you're reading this, you found her, and you stayed. That means something. I don't know who you are. I don't care who you are. There's a letter inside Hazel's collar, the blue one, folded up small. That one's for Wren. It's hers and nobody else's. My sister-in-law is Carol Ann Price. She's in Elkton, Maryland. She's a good woman who is afraid of me, but never of Wren. She doesn't know how bad it got. Tell her, the dogs go with the girl. That's not negotiable. I built that cage because I was scared and I was old and I didn't have another answer. I know how it looks. I know what people are going to say. I need somebody to say something else. Ryker folded the letter, put it in his jacket pocket, sat with the cold air on his face for a moment. Then he looked over at the enclosure where Wren had gone back inside, sitting on the platform with the horse book, Colt's head in her lap, and he understood with a clarity that was uncomfortable in its precision that Earl Dempsey hadn't been writing to whoever showed up. He'd been writing to whoever stayed, and Ryker had stayed. And now the letter was in his pocket, and Carol Ann Price was in Elkton, Maryland, and Deborah Hale was coming back tomorrow with her clipboard, and Dale Ferris was going to county council. And somewhere in the dead farmhouse behind him, there were 2 years of unpaid property tax sitting on top of a child's only home, like the sentence that wouldn't finish kept living in Ryker's chest like a splinter working its way towards something vital. 2 years of unpaid property tax sitting on top of a child's only home like a hand pressed over a mouth. He folded Earl Dempsey's letter and put it back in his jacket pocket and sat on the tailgate and watched the gray sky move and thought about the specific geometry of what was happening here. Because it wasn't random. That was the thing he kept returning to, the thing that had started as instinct at the back of his skull when Dale Ferris stood at the fence line with his raw-boned certainty and his land management board and his 3 weeks ago acquisition filing. Instinct had a texture. It felt like the moment before contact in a building you hadn't cleared yet. A specific quality of air that meant something was already in motion that you couldn't see. Doyle had his phone out. He'd been on it for 20 minutes. Walking the fence line in slow circles, talking in the low, deliberate cadence he used when he was asking questions he already half knew the answers to. Marsh had finished the structural work and was cleaning his tools with the methodical attention of a man who believed in putting things right. Kinney was sitting on his bike with his arms crossed and his eyes on the road, watching the direction Dale Ferris had driven like he expected the truck to come back. Paula Reese was the first to leave. She'd done what she came to do. Documentation complete, both dogs certified, her behavioral assessment written in the clean professional language of someone who knew how to make compassion legible to institutions. She shook Ryker's hand at the truck and looked at him with the frank assessment she'd been applying to everything since she arrived. That child is going to need continuity, she said. Whatever you're doing here, whoever ends up as the legal caregiver, someone familiar needs to stay in the picture. Abrupt transition after this kind of loss does specific damage. She paused. You understand what I'm telling you? Yeah, he said. Good. She got in the truck. Then she rolled the window down. The big dog. Colt. He's got early arthritis in his left hip. It's manageable. Someone needs to know that. She drove away before he could respond. Doyle came back to the tailgate at 2:15 with the specific expression of a man who had confirmed something he wished he hadn't. Talk to me, Ryker said. Doyle sat beside him on the tailgate and looked at his legal pad and then looked at the farmhouse. Dale Ferris is on the land management board, he said. He's also, through a holding company called Consolidated Rural Partners, LLC, one of 3 investors in a proposed solar development project that has been in county planning review for 14 months. He tapped the pad. The proposed development site covers approximately 400 acres of agricultural land in this valley. This property, he nodded toward the farmhouse, sits on 11 acres directly in the middle of the access corridor. Without it, the project can't connect to the county road grid. Ryker was quiet for a moment. So the acquisition isn't about the tax lien. The tax lien is how they do it legally. The acquisition is about clearing the corridor. Doyle's voice stayed flat. Ferris's group has been buying up parcels in this valley for 18 months. Mostly quiet. Mostly from people who didn't know they had options. This one had a complication. An old man who wouldn't sell and then died before they could pressure him further. So they waited for the tax situation to mature and then filed. With a child on the property, who, as far as the board's filing indicates, was not documented as a current resident. Doyle let that land. Someone told the board the property was vacant. Someone who knew it wasn't. Someone who had a reason to need it to be. Ryker looked at the farmhouse, at the enclosure where Wren was reading, at the sky that had gone from gray to the specific dark gray that preceded serious rain. 11 months, he said. What? Deborah Hale said the original welfare report came in 11 months ago. The board filed for acquisition 3 weeks ago. He did the math. 14 months of planning review, 18 months of parcel acquisition, and they wait until the welfare report is 11 months cold and the child is still on the property to file for the land. He looked at Doyle. They knew she was there. Doyle was very still. They filed anyway, he said. They filed anyway. Because if DCFS removes the child and the property is simultaneously acquired, she's gone, and the land is gone, and nobody has standing to connect the two things. Ryker's jaw tightened. It's not neglect of the filing process. It's the filing process working exactly the way they needed it to. The rain started at 2:30, not gradually. The sky simply opened, the temperature dropping 4 degrees in 10 minutes, and the rain came sideways off the ridge to the west with the specific hostility of late October precipitation that hasn't decided if it wants to be sleet yet. Marsh got the tools into the truck. Kinney pulled his bike under the overhang of the collapsed barn at the property's edge. Ryker jogged to the enclosure with a tarp from the truck bed and rigged it over the south-facing gap where wind was driving rain under the roof edge. And Wren watched him do it from the platform, with both dogs pressed against her sides like warm ballast. "It always does this," she said. "In October. Your grandfather fix it when it did? He'd put a bucket." She pointed to the corner where indeed an old metal bucket sat, already collecting drips from 2 spots Ryker hadn't noticed. He moved the tarp, found the gaps, did what he could. "Ryker," she said while he was working. "Yeah. That man this morning, the one without a patch. Ferris. He looked at me like I wasn't supposed to be here." Ryker stopped what he was doing. He looked at her. She was watching him with those eyes that had processed more than a 6-year-old should have to process, and come out calibrated rather than broken. "He's wrong," Ryker said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached into the front pocket of the oversized coat and produced something small, folded many times. A piece of paper. Soft with handling, the folds worn almost to transparency. She held it out. "This was in Hazel's collar," she said. "Grandpa put it there. He told me it was for when someone came who stayed." Ryker took it carefully. It was a letter, different from the one in the journal, shorter, written in the same failing hand but with a different quality. Not instructions, not information. It was a letter to Wren, written for Wren, and Ryker understood immediately that he wasn't supposed to read it. "It's yours," he said, and gave it back. She took it and folded it back exactly the way it had been and put it in her pocket. Then she said, "He wrote one for you, too." "I found it." "Did it say what you needed it to say?" Ryker looked at a 6-year-old girl asking him a question that most adults never thought to ask, and he didn't have an answer that was honest and also simple, so he said the simplest true thing. It said enough. She nodded like that made sense. Then she opened the horse book again, and the rain hammered the tarp above them, and Colt put his chin on her knee, and Ryker sat on the cold ground outside the platform and watched the field turn gray with rain and thought about what Doyle had told him. At 4 p.m., Doyle's phone rang, and the conversation that followed changed everything. Ryker watched Doyle's face during the call. He'd learned to read Doyle's face the way you learn to read weather, not by the dramatic signals, but by the subtle ones, the way the muscles around his eyes shifted, the specific stillness that meant incoming bad information. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Doyle hung up, he stood in the rain for a moment without speaking. "That was a contact at County," he said, "someone I did some work for before I joined the chapter. And Deborah Hale filed her preliminary report this afternoon." He paused. "The 24 hours she gave you. That's not when she's coming back. That's when the report goes to her supervisor for emergency review. If the supervisor approves immediate removal, they don't have to wait." "How long?" He didn't know. Could be tonight. Could be tomorrow morning before 7. Doyle looked at the enclosure. "There's more." "Say it." "The supervisor is a man named Gerald Prout. He's been with the county for 22 years. He sits on 3 advisory boards." Doyle met Ryker's eyes. "One of them is the County Land Management Board." The rain fell between them, and neither of them said anything for a long time. He's going to approve it, Ryker said, immediately. And when he does, removal is law enforcement assisted. Means a sheriff's deputy comes with the caseworker. He paused. And if there are individuals present who impede the removal, we get arrested. Or worse, we give them grounds to paint this as a custody dispute involving an MC, which changes the entire public narrative and buries the land acquisition story under it. Doyle's voice was careful, precise. Ryker, they've done this before. This isn't improvised. Someone planned the sequence. Ryker stood in the rain and felt the cold work through the leather of his jacket and thought about the sequence. The welfare report 11 months ago, not acted on, filed and left open, kept as a legal instrument. The land acquisition filing timed for when the tax lien matured. The board member with supervisory authority over the exact caseworker handling the welfare case. None of it was illegal, technically. None of it left a clean fingerprint. It was the architecture of systems working together without conspiracy, just common interest and the right positioning, and people who had learned that you didn't need to break the rules if you understood them well enough to let them do the work for you. I need to call Cade, Ryker said. You need to do more than that, Doyle said. You need Carol Ann Price in Elkton, Maryland, reachable and willing to be named as a proposed caregiver before that supervisor signs the removal order. If there's a family placement option on record, removal protocol changes. They have to explore it before immediate placement. How much time does that buy? 72 hours minimum? Possibly a week? He paused. If she's willing. Ryker pulled out his phone and went to the truck to get out of the rain. The call to Cade was short. We have a problem that got bigger, Ryker said. How much bigger? The land acquisition under the property is tied to the welfare removal. Same board, timed sequence. They need the child off the property and the property clear before anyone connects the two actions. A silence that was not the calculating kind. It was the other kind. The kind that meant Cade was sitting with something that required a different quality of attention. That's not a coincidence, Cade said. No. Who's the money? Consolidated Rural Partners, LLC. 3 investors. Ferris is one. I don't have the other 2 yet. I'll find them. And the way he said it meant he would. Cade had contacts in the kind of places that kept records of the kind of things people preferred not to be recorded. Not illegal contacts. Just people who understood that information was infrastructure, and who owed him in the specific way that men owed each other when one had carried something heavy for both of them. I need the chapter here tonight, Ryker said. Not for confrontation, for presence. As many members as can ride clean. No priors, nothing outstanding. If a sheriff's deputy shows up and finds a welfare worker and a land board member on one side and a documented group of veterans and law-abiding citizens on the other, the optics change. You're asking them to ride in rain. I'm asking them to ride in rain. Another silence. They'll ride. He paused. Boone. Yeah. You know what this costs you? Ryker looked through the windshield at the enclosure, at the tarp that was holding, at the dim shape of Wren on the platform, reading in the bad light with Colt's head in her lap. I know, he said. He called the number for Carol Ann Price next. He'd found it in the farmhouse, in a small address book in the kitchen drawer, the entry written in the same careful hand as the early pages of the journal before the tremor. He didn't have a script. He'd never been good at scripts. She answered on the 3rd ring with the slightly cautious hello of a woman who had learned not to assume good news from unknown numbers. Ms. Price, he said, my name is Ryker Boone. I'm calling about your niece. The silence on the other end was the specific silence of someone who already knew something was wrong and had been waiting for the particular shape of it to arrive. Wren, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. Another silence, longer. Earl's gone, isn't he? Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. He heard her breath on the line. One long exhale, controlled, the breath of a woman who had been carrying the anticipation of this and was now setting it down. How long? Best I can tell, several months. Wren's been alone on the property since then. Oh, God. Her voice fractured on the second word and then steadied. Is she all right? She's alive and she's not hurt, and she is the most self-possessed 6-year-old I have ever encountered. He meant it. He felt the truth of it in his chest when he said it. But there's a welfare action in process and a land acquisition running underneath it, and I need a family placement option on record before tonight if possible, because without one, tell me what you need, Carol Ann Price said. She didn't ask why he was involved. She didn't ask about the MC patch, or the Harrisburg chapter, or the motorcycle parked in the rain outside a farmhouse in western Pennsylvania. She asked what he needed, and in the asking he heard Earl Dempsey in her. The same directness, the same economy of what mattered, the same willingness to skip past the things that could be sorted later in favor of the thing that needed handling now. He told her. She said she'd call her lawyer within the hour and have a family placement petition filed through the correct county family court channel before morning. She asked for Doyle's direct number for legal coordination. She asked about the dogs, specifically the way a woman asks about a thing she already knows the answer to and wants confirmation of. They're healthy, Ryker said, and they're hers. That's not negotiable. No, Carol Ann Price said. It never was. A pause. Earl wrote to me last year. He told me about the enclosure. I told myself he was managing, that I'd visit in spring. Her voice went flat and precise in the way of self-accounting. I should have gone in spring. Ms. Price, don't, she said, quiet, firm. I know where I failed. You don't need to protect me from it. A beat. You just protect her tonight. I'll do the rest. She hung up. Ryker sat in the truck for a moment with the phone in his hand and the rain on the roof and thought about the particular quality of people who met their failures straight on without negotiating. He didn't know Carol Ann Price. He knew the voice she'd used. It was enough. At 6 p.m., the first headlights appeared on the county road. By 6:30, there were 11 motorcycles parked along the gravel shoulder outside the property, their engines ticking in the cold rain, their riders standing in the wet with the specific calm of people who had learned that standing in bad weather was just standing. Iron Parish out of Harrisburg. 2 men from the Chambersburg satellite group who'd ridden an hour and a half through the dark. A man Ryker knew only as Sergeant, retired Army Ranger, who had no MC patch but rode with the chapter on principle, and whose physical presence communicated something that most people had the intelligence to register without needing it explained. They didn't crowd the property. They didn't perform. They stood at the road line and they were there, which was the thing Ryker had asked for. And it was enough. Colt came to the fence line when the engines arrived, not alarmed but present, the way a senior member of a watch team steps to the perimeter when reinforcements show up. Sits down, acknowledges, returns to work. Kinney brought coffee from a gas station he'd ridden to and back, passed it around without ceremony. Nobody talked much. The rain lessened around 7 and stopped around 7:30, leaving the field in the specific raw quiet of a place that has been recently loud and isn't quite sure it's over. At 8:45, Doyle got the second call. He came to Ryker immediately, and the quality of his walk, not fast, not slow, the walk of a man carrying information that needs to land right, told Ryker before he got there that something had shifted. Prout signed the removal order, Doyle said. My contact says the paperwork went through at 8:15. That's faster than... He had it pre-drafted. Doyle said it without expression. He had the removal order written before Deborah Hale filed her preliminary report. He was waiting for her documentation to attach to it. He let that land. This wasn't reactive. He was running the play before the welfare visit even happened. Ryker looked at him. Someone told him we were here, he said, or he already knew. Ferris was at the property this morning. He had Ryker's name by 10 a.m. Doyle paused. The order specifies law enforcement assistance, sheriff's office, and it names the Iron Parish MC as a potential complicating presence. The sound that moved through Ryker then was not anger exactly. It was the colder thing that lived underneath anger, the recognition of how completely a system could be weaponized by the people inside it, how the tools built to protect the vulnerable could be picked up and pointed the wrong direction without a single rule being broken. When, he said. First light, 6 a.m. window. Doyle met his eyes. If we're still here when they arrive with a deputy, and a signed removal order, and a named MC complication, we're not witnesses. We're the story. Sargent appeared at Ryker's shoulder without having made noise getting there. "I heard," he said. "It's not your problem," Ryker said. "I decide what's my problem." He crossed his arms. "What's the move?" Ryker looked at the enclosure. Wren had gone quiet inside it an hour ago. Asleep, probably, or something close to it. The dogs warm beside her in the wool blanket. He looked at the farmhouse, dark against the darker sky. He looked at 11 motorcycles on the road edge, men standing in the cold because he'd asked them to. He thought about Carol Ann Price saying you protect her tonight. He thought about Earl Dempsey's letter. I need somebody to say something else. He thought about the removal order that had been pre-drafted, about Gerald Prout and Dale Ferris and Consolidated Rural Partners, LLC, and 400 acres of agricultural valley and an 11-acre corridor that belonged to a dead old man who had built a wire enclosure out of love and insufficient options. And he thought about Colt sitting in the rain at the fence line like a soldier who hadn't been relieved yet. "We don't run," he said. "Ryker," Doyle began. "We don't run, and we don't fight." He turned to face them both. "We document everything. Tonight, every photograph, every witness statement, every piece of paper in that farmhouse, every veterinary record, every conversation log, every timestamp. We build the case that Prout and Ferris are counting on nobody having time to build." He looked at Doyle. "Can you file for a temporary restraining order on the property acquisition before 6 a.m.? I'd need a judge willing to— Can you find one?" Doyle was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "There's a family court judge in the county seat who has a prior ruling in a similar intestate case. She doesn't like irregularities in acquisition timing. I've read her opinions." He paused. "I can try." "Try," Ryker said. "Sergeant, I need the men deployed on documentation, not perimeter. Pairs, one with a phone camera, one writing contemporaneous notes. Everything photographed and time-stamped before 10 p.m. Sergeant nodded once and turned and walked back to the road line without fanfare. At 9:30, Doyle found something in the farmhouse that stopped him in the kitchen doorway and held him there long enough that Kinney went to check on him and came back to the fence line with a look on his face that Ryker hadn't seen before. "You need to come see this," Kinney said. The kitchen table had been cleared to work on. Doyle had spread papers there, documents from a shoebox he'd found in the bedroom closet, and among them, in a brown envelope with the county seal on the return address, was a letter dated 14 months ago. Not a tax notice, not a property assessment. It was an offer to purchase, addressed to Earl Dempsey, signed by a representative of Consolidated Rural Partners, LLC. Offering $42,000 for 11 acres of land in a valley where comparable agricultural parcels were selling at $9,000 per acre, more than 4 times fair value, the kind of offer you make when you need a specific piece of land badly enough to overpay and fast enough that the recipient doesn't have time to wonder why. Earl Dempsey had written 2 words across the face of the offer in the heavy, still steady hand of a man whose heart was failing but whose jaw was not. No. ED. And beneath the offer, in the same shoebox, folded together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age, 4 more letters. Same company. Same representative. Escalating figures. 60,000, 75, 90, each one with the same 2 words across the face. No. E.D. Ryker stood at the kitchen table in the lamplight and looked at those 2 words written 5 times by a dying man who had understood exactly what was being asked of him and had refused 5 separate times to give it. And something moved through him that he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not grief, but the specific unquiet of being in the presence of a decision that cost everything and was made anyway. They knew the sale wasn't going to happen, Doyle said, so they waited for him to die. They may have known more than that, Ryker said. Doyle looked at him. The welfare report, 11 months ago. Someone filed it. Ryker looked at the letters. Who filed it? Doyle went very still. It should be on the intake record, he said slowly. Anonymous reports are logged by intake number, but the originating contact information is retained in the case file. Can your contact get it? Not tonight. Maybe morning. He paused. Ryker, if the welfare report was filed by someone connected to the acquisition, then this isn't opportunism, Ryker said. It's a sequence. They filed the welfare report to create the legal instrument for removal. They let it sit 11 months so it wouldn't look connected. They filed the acquisition when the tax lien matured, and they made sure Gerald Prout was positioned to approve the removal when the time came. He looked at the letters with Earl Dempsey's 2 words written across them. This has been running for over a year. The rain started again outside. Soft this time, without the earlier hostility. Just the sound of water on a roof that had been repaired that morning by a man with a Navy Seabee's hands, and enough patience to do the work right. Kinney put the offer letters in a separate evidence envelope. His word for it, though he said it without self-consciousness, because that was what they were, and photographed each one with timestamps before Doyle labeled and stored them. At 10:45, Doyle came to Ryker at the fence line with his phone and a name. "The intake record," he said. "My contact went in personally. The welfare report 11 months ago," he paused, "was filed by a county land management board member acting in their capacity as a mandatory reporter." Ryker looked at him. "Which board member?" Doyle turned the phone so Ryker could see the screen. The name printed in the contact field of an 11-month-old welfare intake record was not Dale Ferris. It was someone Ryker hadn't heard until this afternoon. A third name. Third Investor in Consolidated Rural Partners, LLC. The name was Gerald Prout, the supervisor who had pre-drafted the removal order, the man who had the signed order waiting before Deborah Hale filed her own preliminary report, the man who had filed the welfare report in the first place. Ryker stood in the cold October rain and felt the architecture of it settle into place around him. The specific nausea of understanding a system completely, of seeing every component and how they fit and what they were designed to produce. A 6-year-old girl. 2 dogs. 11 acres. A dead man's refusals stacked in a shoebox. And a removal order with his chapter's name on it, timed for 6 a.m., designed to arrive before anyone could build what they had just spent 12 hours building. He turned to Doyle. "File the TRO," he said. "I'm already writing it." "And Doyle," he looked at him. "When you cite the welfare report origination, make sure the judge sees Prout's name on both documents. The intake and the removal order, same signature, both ends of the same." Doyle filed the TRO at 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes before midnight. Ryker stood outside the truck in the cold and watched Doyle hit send on the encrypted filing portal and then watched him exhale, one long, controlled breath, and put the phone face down on the tailgate like he couldn't look at it anymore. "It's in front of Judge Carla Reeves," Doyle said. "Family court, county seat. She has a standing emergency review protocol for property-adjacent child welfare cases. My contact says she reads her midnight filings. Does she rule on them?" "Sometimes." He paused. "If the irregularities are clear enough." "They're clear enough." "They are." He picked the phone back up. "Now we wait." Waiting was the thing Ryker had never been good at. In theater, waiting meant exposure. It meant the window was open and you were standing in it. He walked the fence line twice, checked the tarp on the enclosure roof, listened to the rain, listened to the road, listened to the specific quality of quiet that meant 11 men were still at their posts without needing to be told twice. He checked his watch at 12:15, at 12:40, at 1:03. At 1:17, Doyle's phone lit up. Ryker was at the tailgate before Doyle reached for it. He watched Doyle read, watched the movement of his eyes, the specific stillness around his jaw, and knew before Doyle said anything that the answer wasn't clean. "She read it," Doyle said. "She won't issue a TRO on the property acquisition tonight. Not without a full evidentiary hearing. She says the filing establishes irregularity, but not clear enough legal basis for an ex parte order on the acquisition alone." He looked up. "But, say it." She flagged the dual signature issue, Prout on the intake report and the removal order, as a potential conflict of interest requiring review. She's issuing a 24-hour administrative hold on the removal order pending conflict of interest investigation through the County Ethics Board. He paused. The 6 a.m. removal is suspended. The sound that moved through Ryker was not relief. It was the specific recalibration of a man who understood that suspended was not stopped, that 24 hours was a hallway, not a room, that Gerald Prout was going to wake up in 4 hours and find out his removal order had been administratively frozen by a family court judge, and react the way men react when they're used to systems working for them and one suddenly doesn't. He's going to move fast, Ryker said. Yes. How fast? Fast enough that we need to be faster. Doyle pocketed the phone. I need Prout's connection to Consolidated Rural Partners in writing before he has time to restructure it. If he's listed as an investor, it's in the LLC's Articles of Organization. Those are public record, but pulling them at 2 a.m. requires someone with direct registry access. Cade, Ryker said. He called Cade at 1:22 a.m. The phone rang once. Talk, Cade said. He was awake. He sounded like he'd been awake for hours, which meant he'd been working the problem from his end without being asked, which was Cade. I need LLC Articles of Organization for Consolidated Rural Partners, Pennsylvania Registry, tonight. I have them, Cade said. Ryker stopped walking. Since when? Since 8 p.m. I pulled every filing associated with Ferris when you gave me his name this afternoon. The sound of papers. 3 investors. Dale Ferris, registered agent. A woman named Sheila Branham. She's a county planner. She's the one who moved the solar project through the planning review process. A pause. And Gerald Prout, listed as managing investor, 22% equity stake. Send it to Doyle. Already did. 20 minutes ago. I was waiting for you to catch up. A beat. Almost dry. Almost warm. Boone. Yeah. The solar project planning application. It lists the 11-acre corridor property as, and I'm quoting the document, anticipated acquisition, currently in municipal lien process. It was filed that way 14 months ago. He let that land. They listed it as acquired before they acquired it, before Earl Dempsey was dead, while he was still in that farmhouse saying no. Ryker stood in the rain. They were that sure, he said. They were that sure. Cade's voice went quiet for a moment in a way it rarely did. They built a man's death into their timeline, Boone. They planned around it. After he hung up, Ryker stood at the fence line for a long time without moving. The rain came and went in thin sheets. Colt appeared at the wire and sat on the other side of it, close enough that Ryker could hear him breathing. He put his fingers through the gap, and the dog pressed his skull against them, heavy and warm, and they stayed like that for a while in the dark. At 2:40 a.m., a car turned off the county road. Not a county vehicle. A private sedan, dark blue, which parked behind the row of motorcycles with the specific confidence of someone who had decided they didn't need to announce their arrival. The man who got out was 60-something, heavy through the shoulders, in a fleece jacket and khakis that said, I am a private citizen, not here in any official capacity, while communicating the opposite through everything else about his posture. Gerald Prout walked to the fence line and stopped 6 feet from Ryker. He looked at the motorcycles, at the men along the road, at the enclosure in the dark, at Ryker. You filed with Judge Reeves, he said. My attorney filed, Ryker said. Same thing. Prout's voice was controlled. The voice of a man who had spent 22 years in county administration developing the specific register of authority that didn't need to raise itself. The hold is temporary. I want you to understand that. By end of business tomorrow, I'll have it reviewed and lifted through what channel? Doyle said. He had appeared from the direction of the farmhouse, legal pad in hand, pen uncapped. Because your standard channel is County Family Services Administration, and your name appears as a conflict of interest in that channel's current case file. So I'm curious which channel you're planning to use. Prout looked at Doyle, at the legal pad, at the pen. Who are you? Marcus Doyle. I'm acting as legal advisor to Ryker Boone, who is the named responsible party for the minor child currently in residence. He said it with the flatness of someone reading a transcript. And I want to make sure you know that this conversation is being documented contemporaneously, time-stamped, and will be available as evidentiary record in any subsequent proceeding. He held up his phone. I'm also recording audio. Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state. You may proceed. Prout looked at the phone. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the first adjustment of a man recalculating. I'm here as a private citizen, he said. At 2:45 in the morning, Doyle said. to a property where you have a documented financial interest in the adjacent land acquisition and a documented administrative role in the active welfare case. In what capacity does a private citizen show up here at this hour, Mr. Prout? Prout shifted his weight. I came to... Did Dale Ferris send you? Ryker said. The pause was less than a second. Less than half a second. But it was there, and Ryker had spent enough time watching men decide what to say next to know what a pause that length meant. I don't know what you think you've uncovered, Prout said. I think I've uncovered a solar corridor acquisition that lists a property as anticipated before its owner died, Ryker said. I think I've uncovered a welfare report filed by a mandatory reporter who turned out to be the same man who pre-drafted the removal order 11 months later. I think I've uncovered an LLC with 3 investors, one of whom runs the county planning process, and one of whom runs the County Family Services Administration, and one of whom sits on the Land Management Board. He held Prout's gaze. Tell me what I got wrong. Prout was quiet. The men along the road were quiet. The rain was quiet. The child's welfare is my only... Prout began. Don't. The word came from Sargent, who hadn't spoken all night, who had been a shape at the road edge for 6 hours, and who now stepped forward 2 steps with the weight of a man who had learned that economy of movement was its own language. Do not say that to us right now. Prout looked at Sargent, at the build of him, at the specific quality of stillness around his eyes that didn't have a civilian translation. He stopped talking. Here's what's going to happen, Ryker said. His voice had gone flat and even, the register he used when there was no room left for negotiation, and everyone in earshot needed to understand that. Carol Ann Price in Elkton, Maryland, has a family placement petition filed through the Correct Family Court channel as of 3 hours ago. Doyle has documentation of your dual signature, intake and removal, that is already in front of Judge Reeves. Cade Morrow in Harrisburg has the LLC Articles of Organization showing your 22% equity stake in the company that lists this child's home as an anticipated acquisition. And every purchase offer sent to Earl Dempsey, everyone he refused, has been photographed and time-stamped and exists as evidentiary record. He paused. In approximately 4 hours, that documentation goes to 3 journalists. 1 at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, 1 at the Philadelphia Inquirer, 1 at a regional land rights nonprofit that covers exactly this kind of acquisition story and has a readership that includes the State Ethics Board. He held Prout's gaze. Unless. Prout's jaw tightened. Unless what? Unless you withdraw the removal order voluntarily before 6 a.m., cite administrative review as the reason, and recuse yourself from all case decisions involving this child and this property going forward. Ryker's voice didn't change. If you do that, the documentation goes to the journalists anyway, because the public interest in what you built here doesn't disappear because you stepped back. But your name goes in as someone who corrected course when confronted, not someone who tried to run a system against a 6-year-old and got caught in daylight. The silence that followed was the longest one of the night. A motorcycle engine on the road edge turned over. Ryker didn't know whose, didn't look, and the sound of it moved through the field and hit the farmhouse siding and came back changed, lower, a vibration you felt in your sternum rather than heard. Then the engine settled to idle. Then another started beside it. Then a third. Not aggression, not theater, just sound. The specific sound of 11 engines saying we are still here without anyone having to say a word. Prout looked at the road line and at the idling bikes, at Doyle with his phone and his legal pad, at Ryker. Something left his posture. Not capitulation. Men like Prout didn't capitulate cleanly or quickly or without condition, but the first structural failure of the certainty he'd arrived with. The thing that happened when a man who'd spent 22 years being the room's gravity suddenly understood he wasn't the heaviest thing present. I need to make a call, he said. To Ferris, Ryker said. Prout said nothing. Make your call, Ryker said. You have until 5:30. Prout walked back to his sedan, got in. The interior light was on for several minutes. The phone was visible through the window. He was talking, not texting, which meant Ferris was on the other end having a conversation that was not going the way the original plan had specified. Doyle came to stand beside Ryker. He's going to try to negotiate, Doyle said quietly. I know. What he negotiates for is time. He's going to offer a partial withdrawal and try to preserve the acquisition through a different channel. I know. So we need something in place before 5:30 that closes the other channels. Doyle paused. The planning applications, the one that listed this property as anticipated acquisition. If that application had a known misrepresentation in it, if the property was listed as anticipated when the owner was still alive and actively refusing to sell, that's a fraud issue in the planning submission. That goes to the State Planning Commission, not the county. Prout has no reach there. Can you file it tonight? I can file a notification of potential misrepresentation with supporting documentation. It doesn't trigger an immediate investigation, but it creates a record that predates any withdrawal or restructuring they try. He paused. It also means the Planning Commission has a flag on the project. They'll freeze any further approvals pending review. Do it, Ryker said. Doyle was back at the tailgate with his laptop before Ryker finished the sentence. At 4:15, Prout's sedan door opened and he got out and walked back to the fence line. He looked older than he had at 2:45. Not physically. The 4 hours hadn't aged him, but in the specific way that men look older when the structure they've been standing on has shifted under them and they can feel it. Ferris wants a meeting, he said. No, Ryker said. He's willing to discuss. I said no. Flat. Final. There's no meeting. There's no discussion. There's a 5:30 deadline and a withdrawal form and a recusal letter, and if both of those aren't in Doyle's hands before the sun comes up, the documentation goes to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and the State Planning Commission gets a fraud notification that will freeze the solar project for 18 months minimum while they investigate. He held Prout's eyes. Tell Ferris that's the meeting. Prout looked at him for a long moment. You understand this doesn't end here, he said. Even if I know it doesn't end here, Ryker said, but it ends for Wren here, tonight. She gets her aunt and her dogs and her grandfather's property and a morning that doesn't start with the sheriff's deputy at the gate. He paused. Everything else is paperwork. I can live with paperwork. At 4:52 a.m., Gerald Prout typed a withdrawal notification on his phone and forwarded it to the County Family Services System with the CC addresses of the Administrative Review Board and Judge Reeves's clerk. He typed a recusal letter in the notes application and emailed it to his own supervisor with a copy to Doyle's contact address. He did both of these things in the headlights of his own sedan, which Doyle had requested so the completion timestamps were verifiable by the vehicle's dash cam. He drove away without another word. The Iron Parish engines went quiet one at a time along the road line, not by signal, but by the collective sense that the pressure had released, not ended, but shifted into a phase that didn't require idling in the rain. Men got off bikes and stretched. Someone produced a thermos. Kinney sat on the ground with his back against his rear tire and his head tipped back and his eyes closed, which was the position of a man who had been running on something for a long time and could now let a small amount of it go. Ryker walked to the enclosure. The rain had stopped. The sky in the east had the first thin lightening of a dawn that was still an hour away. Not color yet, just the suggestion that the dark wasn't as total as it had been. He stood at the wire and Colt came from the inside immediately, pressed his nose through the gap, made the low sound that wasn't quite a whine. Easy, Ryker said. Wren was awake. He didn't know when she'd woken up, whether she'd been awake all night, whether she'd heard any of it. She was sitting on the platform with the blanket around her shoulders and both dogs close and her eyes on him with the full, uncomplicated attention of a child who had learned to read adults for survival information. Is it over? She said. Ryker looked at her, at the platform her grandfather had built her, at the rope handle on the door, at the way Hazel had her head on Wren's knee, exactly the way she'd had it since the first morning he'd come with gas station food and a folding can opener. For tonight, he said honestly. For tonight, it's over. She looked at him for a long moment. The dawn light, what little there was of it, came through the wire and caught her face, and she looked smaller than she was, and older than she should have been, and also, somehow, exactly like what she was. A child who had been alone in a cold field for too long and had survived it by being more resilient than the field deserved. Ryker, she said. Yeah, there's a woman coming. Not a question. She'd heard something or understood something or simply knew in the way children know things when they've had to pay attention. Your aunt, he said. Carol Ann. Your grandfather wrote her name in his address book. He paused. She's a good woman. She knew your mom. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she looked down at Hazel's head on her knee and put her hand on it and said, Can the dogs come? Yes, Ryker said. That's not negotiable. She nodded, slowly, with the weight of someone processing a future that was getting more real with each word. Will you still come? She said. And Ryker stood at the wire in the cold pre-dawn of a Pennsylvania field with dried rain on his jacket and 3 days of no sleep behind his eyes and an engine-low ache in every joint, and he looked at this 6-year-old girl who had trusted him with the specific, careful economy of someone who had very little trust left and had decided to spend some of it on him anyway. And he opened his mouth to say something measured and practical and honest about what he could and couldn't promise. But then Doyle was coming across the field at a run, which Ryker had never seen Doyle do. And the look on his face was not the look of someone bringing good news. And the phone in his outstretched hand was showing a message that Ryker couldn't read yet from this distance. And Colt was on his feet at the wire with his ears forward and his body suddenly taut with the specific alert of an animal that senses something changing before the humans. Doyle's phone showed a photograph. Ryker took it from his hand and looked at it in the thin pre-dawn light and felt something drop in his chest. Not panic, not anger, but the specific cold weight of a thing you prepared for and hoped wouldn't happen anyway. The photograph had been sent from an anonymous number to Doyle's contact at the county clerk's office, forwarded without comment at 4:58 a.m., 6 minutes after Prout had driven away. It showed a document, a county court filing. Emergency petition for expedited property acquisition based on imminent public safety risk. A new angle, a different statute, a channel that bypassed family services entirely and went straight to the county circuit court. Filed at 4:30 a.m. under Dale Ferris's name, with Sheila Branham as co-petitioner. While Prout had been standing at the fence line negotiating his withdrawal, Ferris had been filing from somewhere else. They split the play, Doyle said. He was breathing harder than Ryker had ever heard him breathe. Prout was the distraction. Ferris was always going to move through a different channel if the welfare route closed. What does the public safety petition claim? That the structure on the property... Doyle stopped. His jaw tightened. That the enclosure represents an imminent hazard to the minor child, and that the property therefore requires emergency municipal control pending full environmental and safety assessment. Ryker looked at the enclosure, at the reinforced framing Marsh had repaired, at the tarped roof, at Wren on the platform watching him with those calibrated eyes. They're using the enclosure, he said. The thing that kept her alive, Doyle said. Yes. The specific obscenity of it moved through Ryker like cold water through a crack. Not fast, just thorough, reaching everything. Earl Dempsey had built that structure out of the limited materials of his love and his fear and his failing body, and now 2 men in a land acquisition LLC were going to use it as a legal instrument against the child it was built to protect. He handed the phone back to Doyle and looked at the lightening sky and breathed through his nose for a moment. Which court? He said. County Circuit, Judge Harlan Briggs. Doyle paused. He's not on anyone's board. He's also not sympathetic to emergency petitions without substantive basis, which this may or may not have depending on how Ferris's lawyer frames the structural argument. He paused again. Ryker. Marsh's repair work this morning. The photographs, the timestamps, Paula Reese's documentation. If we can get all of it in front of Briggs before he rules on the petition... How long before he rules? Emergency petition process is same-day review. He could rule by noon. Then we have 6 hours. Sargent appeared at Ryker's shoulder. He'd been close enough to hear. He looked at Ryker, and Ryker looked back at him. And there was a conversation in that exchange that didn't use words because it didn't need to. 2 men who had operated in environments where the situation changed faster than the plan and had learned to update without breaking stride. I'll get Marsh, Sargent said. He was already turning. Ryker went to the enclosure. Wren was still watching him. She had the blanket tied around her shoulders, and both dogs were standing now, reading the shift in the air the way dogs read everything, through the changes in the humans around them, the way breathing changed, the way feet moved on ground. "I need to tell you something," Ryker said. She waited. "There are people who want to use this," he gestured at the enclosure, "as a reason to say the property isn't safe. That's not true. But they're going to try to say it in court this morning." He held her gaze. "I need you to know that's happening so it doesn't surprise you, and I need you to know that we're going to stop it." She looked at the wire around her, at the plywood roof, at the framing her grandfather had sunk in concrete with hands that were already starting to shake. "Grandpa built it safe," she said. "I know. He checked every board." Her voice was steady. "He made me watch so I'd know how. He said a safe place is only safe if you know how it's built." Ryker crouched at the wire. "Wren, would you be willing to tell someone that? A judge? Not today in person, in writing, just what you told me." She thought about it with the seriousness she applied to everything. Then she said, "Can I tell them about Grandpa? Not just the cage. About him." "You can tell them anything you want." She nodded once. "Okay." Doyle produced a legal pad and sat cross-legged on the cold ground outside the enclosure wire at 5:15 in the morning and asked Wren questions in the patient, unhurried manner of a man who had learned that children gave you what they had if you didn't push them toward what you wanted. He wrote everything down in his careful hand: her account of the enclosure's construction, her grandfather's checking and rechecking of the structure, the door that opened from the inside. She was very clear about that, emphatic in the way children are emphatic about the things they understood mattered. The rope handle, the fact that she could always leave, the fact that she sometimes didn't want to because it was where she felt held. That last part Doyle underlined twice without commenting on it. Marsh reviewed the structural photographs at 5:30 with the critical eye of a man assessing his own work, and then wrote a one-page assessment in the flat, technical language of someone with a construction background, documenting the pre-repair condition of the enclosure, the nature of the repairs performed, and his professional evaluation of the structure's safety. He signed it with his full name, James Harlan Marsh, Navy Seabee, retired, and the date and time. At 6 a.m., Doyle submitted the full response package to Judge Briggs's clerk, Paula Reese's veterinary and behavioral assessments, Marsh's structural report, Wren's written statement, the time-stamped photographs, and a 4-page legal memorandum Doyle had written in the truck between 2 and 4 a.m. that laid out the acquisition timeline, the dual signature conflict, the purchase offers Earl Dempsey had refused, and the specific sequence by which Consolidated Rural Partners, LLC, had planned around the death of a man who would not sell them his land. It was the most complete thing Ryker had seen built in a single night by exhausted people who had no obligation to build it. He told Doyle that. Doyle looked at him from the tailgate with red eyes and 3 days of stubble and said, "Don't thank me yet." At 7:43 a.m., Carol Ann Price arrived. She drove a burgundy Subaru with Maryland plates and a crack in the passenger side windshield and a back seat full of things that told you who she was without being asked: reusable grocery bags, a library book, a child's rain jacket in yellow that she must have stopped for on the way because it still had a store tag on it. She parked behind the motorcycles and got out and looked at the assembled men and machines along the road with an expression that wasn't intimidated and wasn't performing calm, just genuinely taking in what she was seeing and adjusting. She was mid-50s, medium height, with the kind of face that had been through enough to make it interesting. Crow's feet from squinting into sun, a mouth that sat in the neutral position of someone who'd learned not to advertise what they were feeling until they knew the room. She wore a fleece over a flannel shirt and practical boots, and she carried herself with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had made her decision before she got in the car and wasn't revisiting it. She found Ryker by looking for the person everyone else was oriented toward, which was accurate. "Ryker Boone," she said. "Miss Price." She looked at him. The jacket, the patch, the 3 days of no sleep, the specific kind of tired that lived in a person's face when they'd been running on something other than rest. She didn't comment on any of it. "How is she?" Carol Ann said. "Strong," he said. "Quiet. She reads constantly. She's been alone a long time, but she's not broken by it." He paused. "She loved your father-in-law. Earl. She talks about him like he was the whole world." Carol Ann's face moved briefly into something unguarded and then back. "He was a difficult man," she said, "but he was a good one. in the ways that matter. She looked at the farmhouse. Can I see her? She's expecting you. He walked her to the enclosure. He hung back when they reached it, because this wasn't his moment, but he watched, because he couldn't not. Wren was standing at the open door of the enclosure when Carol Ann approached. She'd gotten up and brushed her hair, or tried to, with a brush Kinney had found in the farmhouse and brought to her without fanfare. And she was wearing the bird sweater under the barn coat and her rubber boots, and she was holding Hazel's collar loosely in one hand the way she always held it, a habit so deep it wasn't conscious anymore. Carol Ann stopped a few feet away. She looked at Wren for a long moment with the specific look of a woman seeing her sister in a child's face and having to absorb that quietly and quickly. "Hi, Wren," she said. Wren looked at her. "You look like my mom," she said. "In the pictures." Carol Ann's breath caught. Ryker heard it from where he stood. "Yeah," she said, we did. We looked a lot alike." She crouched down to eye level. "I should have come sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." Wren considered this with the moral seriousness of a child who hadn't yet learned to dismiss apologies reflexively. "Grandpa said you were scared of him?" "I was," Carol Ann said honestly. "He was a hard man to know." "He was easy to know," Wren said. "You just had to be patient." Carol Ann looked at her for a moment and then made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, but something in between. The sound of a person who has just been corrected by a 6-year-old in a way that was completely accurate. "Yeah," she said. "I guess I wasn't patient enough." Wren let go of Hazel's collar and the dog moved forward and sniffed Carol Ann's outstretched hand with deliberate thoroughness. Then Colt came and did the same. Carol Ann held still through both assessments with the intuition of a woman who understood that this was not optional and not symbolic. It was the actual evaluation, the one that mattered. Colt pressed his nose into her palm. Then he turned and walked back to Wren's side. "They like you," Wren said. The relief in her voice was the first completely unguarded thing Ryker had heard from her. "I'll take that," Carol Ann said. At 9:15, Judge Harlan Briggs rejected Dale Ferris's emergency petition. Doyle got the ruling notification on his phone and read it standing at the tailgate, and then read it again, and then looked up and said he denied it with prejudice. A pause. With prejudice means they can't refile on the same basis. The field absorbed that information without ceremony. Kinney, who had been awake for 26 hours, said, "Huh," and went back to drinking coffee. Marsh nodded at no one in particular and pulled out his phone and called someone and said, "Yeah, it's done. Come home when you're ready." Domestic and simple and so ordinary it made Ryker's chest ache. Sargent looked at the sky. "Going to clear by noon," he said. Nobody contradicted him. The ruling cited the response package's documentation as establishing clear record of the enclosure's structural integrity, the behavioral evidence of the child's psychological relationship to the space, and, in language that Doyle read aloud in a voice that had gone carefully flat, the concerning timing of the petition relative to the ongoing conflict of interest review triggered by Judge Reeves's overnight flag on Gerald Prout's dual signature. Briggs had connected the dots without being asked to. He'd seen the architecture. At the bottom of the ruling, in a section labeled Additional Note, Judge Briggs had written 4 sentences that weren't legally required and were there anyway. Doyle read them aloud. The court notes that the evidentiary record submitted in response to this petition reflects an unusual degree of community investment in the welfare of the minor child. The structural assessment, veterinary documentation, and testimony provided suggests that the child has had meaningful and consistent adult support during a period when institutional systems failed to provide it. The court finds this relevant context in evaluating the petition's characterization of the property as an imminent hazard. The characterization is not supported by the record. Doyle lowered his phone. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Wren, who had been standing near the enclosure door listening, said quietly, "What does that mean?" Ryker crouched down to her level. "It means a judge looked at everything your grandfather built and everything everyone here did last night and said it wasn't neglect. It was love under hard circumstances. And the people trying to use it against you lost." She looked at him. "Is it over?" she said. Again, the same question she had asked before dawn with the same tone. Not hopeful, not fearful, Just checking, the way you check a structure to make sure it's still standing. The legal part, he said. Yeah, it's over. What about the other part? There's going to be more paperwork, more meetings. Your aunt will handle most of it, and Doyle will help her. He held her gaze. But the part where someone could come and take you away from Colt and Hazel and put you somewhere without them, that part is over. She nodded, slow, processing. Then she turned and went back into the enclosure and sat on the platform and pulled both dogs to her in the specific, graceless way children hug large animals. No elegance, just the full weight of her relief pressed into warm fur. And she stayed there like that for a long time. Ryker stood up. His knees ached, his back ached. His eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sand. He was 41 years old, and he'd been awake for 30 hours, and he felt every single one of both numbers. Sergeant put a hand on his shoulder from behind. Not a grip, just a weight. Present, acknowledged, gone again. The forensic part of the morning took until 11. Deborah Hale arrived at 9:30. Alone, no county vehicle, personal car, and stood at the fence line with an expression that Ryker couldn't immediately categorize. Not defensive, not embarrassed. Something more complicated than either. I didn't know about Prout, she said. I know, Ryker said. I mean, I knew he was my supervisor. I didn't know about the... She stopped. I filed that report in good faith. The conditions were... I know what the conditions looked like, Ryker said. I also know what they were. She looked at the enclosure, at Carol Ann, who was sitting on the ground outside the wire talking to Wren in the easy, patient cadence of two people beginning to learn each other, at Colt, who had his head in Carol Ann's lap with the unhesitating confidence of a dog who had done his assessment and made his determination. The family placement petition, Deborah said. Ms. Price, she's legitimate, stable, situation. 3-bedroom house in Elkton, librarian, no priors, demonstrably prepared to take both dogs. Doyle appeared beside Ryker with the legal pad and delivered this information with the precision of a man who anticipated the question. I have her background documentation if you need it for the case file. Deborah looked at the legal pad. At Doyle. You're not a licensed attorney. Pre-law. 3 years. I know the difference between what requires a bar card and what doesn't. He held the legal pad out. Everything in here is admissible as lay witness documentation. You can verify every citation. She took it, looked through it for a long time. Her face moved through several things. I'm going to file a recommendation for family placement with Ms. Price, she said finally. With the dogs. The behavioral documentation from Dr. Reese is... She stopped, started again. It's the clearest therapeutic attachment assessment I've seen in 15 years of casework. She paused. I'm also going to file an internal complaint about Prout's dual signature. I should have caught it. I didn't. That's on me. It's on him, Ryker said. Both, she said. And the way she said it was the way of a person who had decided not to negotiate with her own accounting. She left at 10:15 with Doyle's documentation and the weight of something she was carrying differently than she'd carried it when she arrived. The Iron Parish men drifted out through the morning the way they'd arrived. Not all at once, not with ceremony. Kinney was the first to go because he had a shift at the auto shop he was already 4 hours late for and hadn't called about. He stopped by the enclosure fence on his way to the bike and looked at Wren and said, The roof seems going to hold. Check it after rain anyway. Practical. Final. She nodded like she was filing it. The two men from Chambersburg left together before 10, shaking hands with Ryker in the manner of people who'd shared something and didn't need to name it. Sargent was last of the road line, and before he mounted his bike, he walked to the enclosure and crouched at the wire and looked at Colt for a long moment. Good dog, he said. Colt's tail moved once, slow and certain. Sargent got on his bike and was gone. Marsh stayed until noon because there was a fence post on the property's north corner that had been working its way out of the ground for what looked like 2 seasons, and he'd spotted it on his morning walk-around, and it bothered him on a structural level that he couldn't leave without addressing. He dug it out and reset it with a bag of quick-set concrete he produced from the truck bed with the matter-of-fact preparedness of a man who carried the materials of repair wherever he went. He did it without telling anyone he was doing it. Ryker found him tamping the base with a fence post pounder and stood watching him work for a while. "You don't have to do that," Ryker said. "I know," Marsh said. That was the whole conversation. At 12:30, Doyle sat across from Ryker on the tailgate with 2 cups of gas station coffee that had been reheated in the truck's cup holder and were now something closer to coffee temperature brown liquid than coffee, and they drank them without comment on the quality. "Prout's going to be investigated," Doyle said. "The ethics board flag and the circuit court ruling together. Someone's going to pull the full thread. When they do, Consolidated Rural Partners is going to unravel. The planning application had a fraudulent designation. Branham's position as county planner is going to be untenable." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Ferris might survive it. He's got money for lawyers. But the solar project is dead. The acquisition is dead." "Earl's land stays Earl's land," Ryker said. "Goes to Wren through intestate succession, with Carol Ann as guardian, which means Carol Ann will manage it until Wren's of age." He paused. "It's not worth much as farmland, but it's hers." Ryker nodded. "Doyle," he said. "Yeah." "What you built last night, the brief, the timeline, all of it, you did that in—" "Don't," Doyle said. "The way Cade said don't when you started toward gratitude he wasn't comfortable with." Ryker stopped. They drank the bad coffee. "You ever gonna finish that pre-law degree?" Ryker said. Doyle looked at the cup. "I keep thinking about it." "You should." "I know." A pause. "I keep getting distracted by situations like this." "Those situations are why you should." Doyle looked at him sideways. "That's the most I've heard you say about someone else's future in 9 years. Ryker drank his coffee. At 2 p.m., Carol Ann Price and Ryker stood together at the open enclosure door while Wren packed what she wanted to take. It was not much. The books, carried in a cardboard box they'd found in the farmhouse kitchen. The blanket, a tin box that had been under the platform and contained things Ryker didn't look at, but that Wren handled with the careful attention of an archive. Earl Dempsey's address book. The framed photograph from the farmhouse bedroom, the only one, that showed a man in his 50s standing in front of this same farmhouse with a border collie at his feet and the specific squinting look of a man who didn't like having his picture taken but had permitted it because someone had asked. She put everything in the back of Carol Ann's Subaru herself, one trip at a time, while the dogs watched from the open tailgate. Then she went back to the enclosure. She stood in the doorway of it, looking in, at the platform. The wool blanket's ghost. She'd taken it, but the shape of its use was still in the wood, the tin cup with the lid, the rope handle, interior side worn smooth where her hand had been. Carol Ann looked at Ryker. He shook his head slightly. Let her have it. Wren stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she reached up and untied the rope handle from the interior latch. She coiled it carefully, the same knot she always used, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she pulled the door shut from the outside. She didn't lock it. She just closed it. She turned around. "Okay," she said. Carol Ann put her hand out. Wren looked at it for a moment and then took it, and they walked to the car together with Colt and Hazel close on either side and the afternoon light coming through the cloud cover at the flat, honest angle of late October in a Pennsylvania field. Ryker stood at the enclosure and watched them go. He stood there for a while after the car doors closed and the engine started. He listened to it pull out of the gravel and onto the road, and the sound of it change as the tires hit blacktop and then diminish to nothing in the direction of the highway that would take them south and east toward Maryland, toward a house with 3 bedrooms and a library book and a back seat and a yellow rain jacket still tagged from the store. Then there was just the field, the farmhouse, the sky, the enclosure door he'd watched her close from the outside for the first time. The specific finality of a door closed by someone who was leaving rather than staying. The fence post Marsh had reset, fresh concrete still damp at the base, the tarp he'd rigged on the roof seam, which was still holding. He stood there for a while with his hands in his jacket pockets and the cold air doing what October cold air did, and he didn't move because there was something in the stillness of the place that hadn't been there before. Not emptiness, but the specific quality of a space that had completed its purpose. Not abandoned. Done. Doyle was the last to leave besides Ryker. He packed his legal pads into his saddlebag with the same methodical attention he applied to everything, and then stood with his hand on the Dyna's grip and looked at Ryker. "You going back to Ohio?" he said. "Eventually. Cade's going to want a debrief." "I know." Doyle looked at him for a moment with the specific gaze of a man who knew when not to ask a question. Then he nodded, threw a leg over the bike, and started the engine. That low primary-driven sound, honest and unambiguous. "Boone," he said. Ryker looked at him. "You did right," Doyle said. Simple. The way Doyle said things when he meant them most. Then he was gone. The sound of the Dyna carrying up the road and over the ridge and away until the valley held nothing but wind. Ryker walked the property once. Just once, slowly, starting at the gate and following the fence line all the way around. He looked at Marcia's postwork. He looked at the farmhouse with its chalky paint and its sagging porch, left side, and its boarded upper window, and its kitchen with the 2 plates on the shelf and the chair by the window that held the shape of a man who had sat in it for decades. He looked at the east wall of books, all those encyclopedias, all those readers, all those nature volumes, and thought about a man with shaking hands reading aloud to a child in a wire enclosure while his heart quietly failed him, covering the distance between what he could give and what she needed with the only currency he had left. He thought about what Carol Ann had said. He was a difficult man, but he was a good one, in the ways that matter. He thought about Wren saying he taught me everything. He thought about the rope handle in her coat pocket. He went back to the Harley. He sat on it for a while without starting it, just sitting, feeling the cold of the seat through his jeans and the weight of the machine under him, solid and specific. He took Earl Dempsey's letter out of his jacket pocket and read it one more time in the flat afternoon light. "I need somebody to say something else." He folded it back and held it in his hand for a moment and then put it away. He thought about Doyle and the pre-law degree, about Marsh and the fence post, about Kinney saying it's fixed to a child who needed to hear something was, about Sargent saying good dog to an animal who had been working without relief for months and deserved to be seen for it, about 11 men standing in the rain because he'd asked them to, and not one of them had asked what was in it for them. He thought about what it was, what the Iron Parish actually was, underneath the patches and the engines and the specific kind of men it collected. He'd joined it 6 years ago because Cade had asked him to, and he'd had nothing else to do with his hands and his nights. He'd stayed because of the specific quality of the silence between these men. Not the absence of communication, but the presence of understanding, the kind that came from having all been in rooms where the floor didn't hold and learning to stand in those rooms anyway and not make it into a performance. He started the Harley. The engine turned over with the low, rolling authority he knew the way he knew his own heartbeat, and the sound of it spread out across the field and hit the farmhouse and the enclosure, and came back to him changed, lower, wider, the way sound changes when it passes through space that means something. He sat with the engine running for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a small thing. The photograph of Wren that Carol Ann had taken on her phone that morning and printed at a pharmacy on the way through the county seat, printing 2 copies, pressing one into his hand without ceremony before she left. It showed Wren standing outside the enclosure door with both dogs flanking her, looking at the camera with those old, steady eyes. And she was not smiling exactly, but her face had a quality it hadn't had the first day. Something looser around the edges, something that wasn't expecting the worst. He put it in the inside pocket, close to the chest. He put the Harley in gear and pulled out of the gravel shoulder onto the blacktop and pointed it south, toward the county road, toward the highway, toward Harrisburg, where Cade would be sitting with a cup of terrible coffee and his own patient silence, waiting for Ryker to come back and tell him what the road had required this time. The farmhouse shrank in the mirror and then disappeared as the road curved, and the field opened wide on both sides. Dead grass and pale sky, and the specific austere beauty of a valley that had been farmed and fallow and farmed again, and would outlast everyone who had ever had opinions about it. Ryker opened the throttle, and the engine answered, and the cold air hit him full in the face, and he rode. He rode out of the valley and up the grade toward the ridge, and at the top, The whole agricultural plain spread out below him in the late afternoon light, enormous and indifferent, and briefly, from this height, almost golden. He didn't stop. He just passed through it, that moment of altitude, of perspective, of being briefly able to see the shape of the whole before the road took him back down into it. He thought about 6 a.m. He thought about a removal order pre-drafted by a man who had filed the welfare report that justified it. He thought about a child pulling an enclosure door shut from the inside, and the specific courage of that. He thought about Earl Dempsey's number ED written 5 times in a hand that got shakier each time. He thought about what it cost, what everything had cost. The night, the men, the exposure, the paperwork that Doyle was going to spend weeks cleaning up, the attention that had landed on the Iron Parish from a county that now had multiple proceedings involving their presence. Cade had been right about what it would cost. Ryker had known Cade was right. He'd known, and he'd asked anyway. That was the thing he kept returning to as the highway opened up and the miles accumulated and the afternoon light went the color of cold copper on the fields on either side. He'd known, and he'd asked anyway. And the men had come, and nobody had been broken by it, and a 6-year-old girl was in a burgundy Subaru heading south with her dogs and her grandfather's address book and a rope handle in her coat pocket, and the knowledge, the specific, earned, hard-won knowledge, that when the system built to protect her had looked the other way, something else had held. Not a system, not an institution, not a process. People. Specific people with specific histories of their own damage, operating out of something that wasn't policy and wasn't protocol, that didn't have a form to fill out or a box to check, just the old, difficult, inelegant decision to be present when presence was what the situation required. He rode until dusk. He stopped at a diner outside Harrisburg where he'd stopped before, a place that had been there since the 60s and smelled like it, coffee and old griddle and the specific warm plastic smell of vinyl booths that had absorbed decades of other people's conversations. He took the corner booth and ordered coffee and eggs and sat with his jacket on because the diner was drafty and he didn't care. And he looked at his phone for the first time in hours. There was a text from a number he didn't recognize, sent at 3:47 p.m. He opened it. "This is Carol Ann. Ren asked me to send you something. She said you'd know what it meant." Below the text was a photograph, blurry, taken by a child with uncertain aim. It showed the back of Carol Ann's Subaru seat, and the top of Ren's head, and the enormous flank of Colt asleep beside her, and Hazel's nose pressed to the window, and beyond the window the Maryland highway in the late afternoon light, moving, just the road and the dogs and the window and the light, and the blurry proof that they were somewhere they hadn't been before. Ryker set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a while. The coffee came. He wrapped his hands around the cup and felt the heat work into the cracks in his knuckles and the stiffness in his palms. And he sat there in the warm noise of the diner with the sound of other people's ordinary evenings all around him and let himself be still. Outside, the Harley waited in the parking lot under the first stars of a clear night. Cold, solid, patient the way a good machine is patient, the way anything is patient that has been built for the long road rather than the fast one. Ryker drank his coffee. He thought about Ren saying, "Will you still come?" He hadn't answered her that morning. He'd been about to when Doyle ran across the field and the night changed shape again, and the moment had closed before the words could get out. He picked up his phone. He typed, "Tell her yes." He looked at it for a moment, then he added, "Tell her the dogs can expect me too." He sent it and put the phone away and looked at the window and the dark outside it and the stars coming in over the ridge to the west, cold and abundant and entirely indifferent to the particular human weight of what had happened in a Pennsylvania field over the course of 4 days and one long night. He finished the coffee. He paid the check. He put his jacket collar up against the cold and walked out into the parking lot and swung onto the Harley and sat there for a moment with the engine off, just sitting, the way you sit when you're about to start something and want to be present for the starting of it. Then he turned the key. The engine came up with that low, honest sound, not loud, not performing, just running, the way things run when they've been properly maintained and are being asked to do the work they were built for. He pulled out of the lot and onto the road and pointed it toward the chapter house, and Cade's terrible coffee, and the debrief, and whatever came next. Behind him, the diner light fell yellow across the parking lot, and the stars sat above the ridge, and the valley lay dark and cold and settled behind him. The enclosure door closed from the outside. The concrete damp around a fence post Marsh had reset because it needed resetting. The rope handle in a child's coat pocket going south through the dark toward Maryland, toward a warm house, toward a room that didn't yet know her, but would. The road took him. He let it. The Harley's sound carried up into the cold night air and spread and thinned and finally disappeared, and the highway was quiet, and the stars held. And somewhere in a burgundy Subaru, a 6-year-old girl slept between two dogs with her hand in her coat pocket around a coiled rope, and she slept without fear for the first time in a very long time. Because some things, once built, hold. Even when the builder is gone, even in the cold, even in the dark, even then.